Welcome to the Hospital Finance Podcast, your go-to source for information and insights that can help you stay ahead of the challenges impacting healthcare finance. And now, the host of the Hospital Finance Podcast, Michael Passanante.
Hi, this is Mike Passanante, and welcome back to the Hospital Finance Podcast. Each year, CMS makes changes to DRGs under the IPPs rule that affect how hospitals are reimbursed. And to help us understand the impact of those changes for 2018 and what we might be looking at in 2019 is Mary Devine, who is the Director of Revenue Cycle Services here at Bessler. Mary, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be back.
So my guess is many in our audience are familiar with the concept of a DRG, but for those who may not be, could you just briefly explain that for us?
Sure. So the DRG started in 1982 as part of the Tax and Fiscal Responsibility Act. It was designed as a statistical system of classifying any inpatient stay into groups for payment. The DRG system divides possible diagnoses codes for more than 20 major body systems and subdivides them into almost 500 groups for Medicare reimbursement. It really takes into consideration the severity of illness, the complexity of the treatment, as well as other things that impact the reimbursement, wage index, capital expenditure, that kind of thing. This really was started mostly for Medicare, but at this point, so many payers are utilizing the DRG system on one level or another.
And there are dozens and dozens of DRG codes, and each year, as I mentioned in the intro, CMS makes changes to them to sort of just update their latest thinking on reimbursement and certain issues, which makes it important to keep on top of those changes, right?
Oh, absolutely. So, and just in some of those things that the reason you want to stay on top of these changes is, it really impacts how the DRGs are grouped and subgrouped, which impacts how you are reimbursed. So you want to make sure you understand what the changes are and how they're going to be grouped and how your reimbursement is going to be impacted. And some of the other things that get impacted are whether the DRG is impacted by the transfer rule or not, or whether they're categorized as a special payment for new technology or new medical services.
So let's get into some of the meat of the changes that happened in 2018. Could you just explain some of the highlights of DRG changes for this year?
Absolutely. So there was a reduction in MSDRGs from 757 to 754 for 2018. There were 3 DRGs that were deleted, 984, 985, and 986. There were several DRG name changes to really clarify the actual MSDRG diagnosis code. So when you look at the DRG description, you can more tell the diagnoses that go into making up that DRG. There were no new DRGs added to the list of MSDRGs subject to the post-acute care transfer policy, and additionally, there were none that were eliminated from that list. So the transfer policy is impacted by 280 DRGs for 2018.
And in addition to DRGs, so a little bit different than what we've just talked about, but CMS makes changes to the ICD-10 codes that are there as well, and those affect, of course, how claims are coded. Can you give us a recap on those? Sure.
So, there were a lot of ICD-10 changes. There were 324 new ones added for the CMs. There were 3,151 PCS procedure codes added, and then there were 38 invalid CM codes that were eliminated. And there were 641 procedure codes that were eliminated in 2018. They did some 43 title changes as well as 1,808 procedure code title changes. And mostly these were impacted in 4 chapters. So it was Chapter 4 for the endocrine and nutritional diagnoses. There were codes in Chapter 5, which for mental health and behavioral health diagnoses. There were some in Chapter 9, which was for circulatory system diagnoses. And then Chapter 15 had a bunch as it relates to pregnancy and childbirth.
Right now, as we're doing this podcast, the 2019 proposed IPPS rule is out, and of course there are some DRG and ICD-10 changes proposed in that one. Can you tell us what they are?
Sure. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that 2019 is just proposed at this time, and Medicare is still taking comments for people to weigh in on what was proposed. So as it's proposed right now, there would be an increase in the MSDRGs from 754 to 759. There are proposed a bunch deleted as well as new additional ones. And the big additional ones are as it relates to some childbirth and delivery, whether it be vaginal or cesarean. There would be the biggest changes as it relates to the DRGs. And then additionally, there are no new DRGs included in the transfer policy, and none for the payment for the special payment, which is again towards the new technology and new medical services.
Now, in the 2019 proposed rule, there are some specific changes that affect hospice under the transfer rule. Can you explain them for us?
Sure, and that to me is the biggest change in the proposed rule. Currently, under the transfer policy, anything that's coded a discharge status code of a 50 or a 51, indicating that the patient's going off to receive inpatient hospice or outpatient hospice, all those DRGs are excluded from the payment policy. So when the patient gets discharged, and if they have a length of stay that is below the geometric mean length of stay, and they get coded a 50 or a 51 as a discharge status, the hospital would receive the full DRG payment on those. Starting in October of 2018, once a claim is coded a 50 or a 51, for the 280 DRGs that are listed as affected by the transfer policy, they will now be impacted by the policy with the 50 or 51, and they will receive the per diem payment versus the full DRG. And again, this is in the proposed, but I do believe that it is going to be passed and going to be effective for all discharges starting October 18.
Okay, and Mary obviously went through a lot of detail here today and talked a lot about DRG codes in depth, and we have more information on our blog with the post that's related to this episode, so please go there and give that a look for some additional detail. And I'll also mention that if you'd like additional validation on whether or not you're recovering all of your transfer DRG overpayments and underpayments, take a look at our transfer DRG service on Bessler.com as well, and we'd be happy to talk with you more about that. Mary, thanks so much for visiting us today on the Hospital Finance Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
If you enjoy the Hospital Finance Podcast, please head up to iTunes to subscribe and leave us a positive review.
This concludes today's episode of the Hospital Finance Podcast. For show notes and additional resources to help you protect and enhance revenue at your hospital, visit Bessler.com/podcasts. The Hospital Finance Podcast is a production of Bessler. Smart about revenue, tenacious about results.